Labor is a commodity like any other, and its price is therefore determined by exactly the same laws that apply to other commodities. In a regime of big industry or of free competition, as we shall see, the two come to the same thing. The price of a commodity is, on the average, always equal to its cost of production. Hence, the price of labor is always equal to the cost of production of labor. But the cost of production of labor consists of precisely the quantity of means of subsistence necessary to enable the worker to continue working, and to prevent the working class from dying out. The worker will therefore get no more for his labor than is necessary for this purpose. The price of labor, or the wage, will, in other words, be the lowest, the minimum, required for the maintenance of life. However, since business is sometimes better and sometimes worse, it follows that the worker sometimes gets more and sometimes gets less for his commodities. But again, just as the industrialist, on the average of good times and bad, gets no more and no less for his commodities than what they cost, similarly, on the average the worker gets no more and no less than his minimum. The economic law of wages operates the more strictly the greater degree to which the big industry has taken possession of all branches of production. Now this is an interesting section, considering this is probably the most economical we're going to get. The following sections, of course, are socio-economical, but this is probably the most economical we're going to get as of right now. One of the points that I want to get into this section is labor power as a commodity. Labor power as a commodity is one of the many inputs for the cost of production. And because it's one of the many inputs, it also determines the price of a commodity. Now we can get into that whole, how the hell does a capitalist marks the price of a commodity, but know for now that one of the main determining factors is the wages that the capitalists have to pay for. Now, I'm not going to get into that whole spiel, but I am willing to go into the MCM circuit that I am going to talk about later in the video. Know for now that one of the main contributing factors for the cost of production is the wages themselves. And that's going to be really important when discussing about surplus value and the entire MCM circuit in general. But let's go upon that labor power, that being labor power as a commodity. Labor power is a commodity in the world of capitalism. It is only sellable by a pro for the capitalist gains, but for the pro themselves is a means of subsistence. That being, if a pro refuses to sell their own labor power, the capitalists can just look for other pros to buy their own labor power, and that pro who denied selling their own labor power earlier shall perish, as they have no means to live. That's as simple as it's going to get. When they're talking about selling one's own labor power, you either do it or perish. There is no choice. The only real option to continue one's existence is to sell yourself to the system. Now, as an aside, before I go upon the MCM circuit, I will discuss just where Marx and Engels derived their economic law of wages. They derived it from both Ricardo's Iron Law of Wages and Adam Smith's law of wages. Now note that Ricardo derived his law from Adam Smith, but it's only fair to point out that Marx and Engels' law of wages does derive from both Ricardo and Smith. Without further ado, let's actually get on the subject of the MCM circuit itself. Albeit this entire section of the video is more suited for a proper core concepts video of just Marx and and every Marxist thereon, I am willing to talk about the MCM circuit right now. And if you're a friend of mine, wherever, you probably already know what I'm talking about, and what I'm going to be talking about. The Pervert's Guide to the MCM circuit, that I jokingly call it, every time that I just want to simply reference it, and just give them just an easy, maybe not superficial, but easy and clear way of looking at the MCM circuit in a more universal sense, not in a particular sense. That's going to be very important. And it's very important right now in this entire series, the discussion of universals and particulars, universalities and particularities. But that's enough rambling about that, and now let's actually get on to this section. The first item that I'm going to bring up is M, or the first letter in the MCM circuit. M, for Marx, Engels, and every Marxist here on out, references M as money, capital. Money, or capital, can be split up into even more categories. The major two categories that I'm going to talk about is constant capital and variable capital. Constant capital, or denoted with little c, is the investment of machines and resources and the upkeep of them in general, while variable capital, or as denoted sometimes as little v, and is sometimes symbolized as wages, which that also is symbolized as labor cost, which that feeds into the cost of production, is essentially the capitalists at first buying up the labor power and then upkeeping that, just like they would with constant capital. But that's going to be an important discussion later on. Also, money feeds in to what will be later called M prime, or basically new money or new capital. But I'm going to discuss that later. The second letter that I'm going to bring up, and actually all the letters in the MCM circuit are always capitalized, so just keep that in mind when talking about Marxist economics, or just looking at Marxist equations in general. Anywho, C is commodity, but that's only in the abstract sense. Now let's see what being a commodity entails for Marx. One of the many sub-concepts when talking about a commodity, especially in the marketplace, is the discussion of zero-sum exchange. I lose what I gain, or I gain what I lose. Only in the marketplace. Because the marketplace is a realm of equality. It's where everybody is technically seen as equals, as long as you have the money to pay up for the commodity. Anywho, this is very important because we don't believe in the concept of positive sum exchange, which really is a distortion of zero-sum exchange and is trying to redress itself as such. But that, again, that's an entire discussion between the exchanges that I'm willing to believe that Paul Cockshott is going to cover fairly well. But anyways, let's get on to the next sub-concept about what commodities are and what they entail in the marketplace. Now let's prematurely get on to the discussion of use value, or the value that a subject, an I, a he, a she, a they, the use value of a person in relationship to a commodity. The use value of a commodity for the bourgeoisie is only for selling. The capitalist no more cares for a commodity other than the money that they'll reacquire and hopefully make up for the cost of production. Literally, the use value of a commodity is the sell. But as you see later on, the use value does not equate to the exchange value of a commodity, especially it doesn't equate to the price of a commodity. They co-determine each other, but I'm going to discuss that later on. The use value of a commodity for the buyer, that is not the middleman, is only to buy until the exchange is made, which then the use value collapses simultaneously, and I'm using simultaneously in the Hegelian sense, mind you, so really we're not really meeting simultaneously, but still. And once they acquire the commodity and give up their money, which that also is a commodity, I'm going to let you know that right now. But anyways, once the buyer sees the commodity that they have acquired, that they have wanted or needed in their lives, that's the use value of a commodity then. But before the exchange, literally was only meant to be bought. This is the entire discussion between psychoanalysis and also literally economics. This is a point where literally psychoanalysis and economics branch together. This is also an entire point where sociology branches together as well with economics. But again, 2 and 3 entire branches that deserve their own due respect in their own due video. Right now, this is mainly an economics video, so I'm going to stay on topic with economics. Now remember when I mentioned the middleman? Well, the use value of a middleman is to sell it once they have bought it from other vendors or the capitalist themselves. But this use value isn't entirely equally transferred from people to people when looking at the middleman. That is to say, from a middleman to another middleman, the use values don't equal each other. Yes, to a point they equal each other. That is literally, to be sold once they acquire it. But at the point of exchange, one wants to use it to sell it, and one wants to use it to be bought, so then, later, once they finally acquired it, it can be sold to another middleman or to the market themselves. This is really where economics, where you're discussing, the steps it takes for a commodity to be A, extracted from wherever it got from, the resources from the natural earth, all the way to the plant, which then will be worked upon by the workers, which then is carried to a truck, that is carried by the truck to a middleman, which the capitalist already arranged, contacts with that middleman. The middleman will buy it, and then depending upon how many middlemans it will take to the marketplace, that's how many middlemans it will take. And then there's this whole entire moving and shifting. It's really disgusting when you have to trace the entire steps of a commodity from a marketplace to the plant itself. And this is not even going into real discussion of all the individual parts that makes up a commodity and where they came from. And then their origin, the resources, is an entire mess describing about geology and whatnot. This entire discussion can really hamper on for hours, discussing about where a stupid banana came from. In any due market. But again, a discussion for another time. And I'm going to sound like a broken record every time I'm going to say this, but another discussion for another time. Let's continue on. Now we get to the final letter, M prime, or new money / new capital. M prime, in its most universal sense, which doesn't consider contingencies as an entirely separate category to its own equation, is entirely composed of M, remember capital from before, surplus value, which I'm going to discuss later, and that's denoted by little s, and that's important for entire equations, but again, discussion for another time, sorry, and super profits. These are your three main contingencies that makes up this entire contingent element of the MCM circuit. Now, due to the fact that M prime is new money, it's going to feed back to this entire circuit. Now, the MCM circuit isn't a circle. It's, again, just like with any other dialectic that Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, Mao, Hegel, and anybody before their times and anybody ahead of their times will tell you, well, not directly, of course, that every dialectic, including the MCM circuit, is a spiral. Of course, some dialectics are negative and positive. I'm going to refer to you to a previous video where I mentioned this in the Section 4 analysis and explanation. But essentially, this circuit is a dialectically positive circuit. It's going to replenish itself. It's going to rebirth itself. Yes, there's some negative elements, but it's mainly positive. It only seeks to rebirth itself, to reproduce itself. And that's a Marxist lingo right there. Reproduce. A lot of these words that you're going to hear right now, in fact, it's essentially Marxist verbiage. These first 5 sections really contains a lot of hidden verbiage that you're assumed to know if we're going past the superficial analysis of this work. But now, before I talk about surplus value, little s, I'm going to talk about socially necessary labor time. Socially necessary labor time, shortened to many times to being SNLT, is the socially necessary time it takes a commodity to be produced, with living labor, of course. Now, let's just analyze one company in one industry for a marketplace that supports that industry in general. Now, if the individual company's socially necessary labor time is higher than the market's socially necessary labor time, what does that implicate? If you're really smart, you should already know that if it takes a company a lot of time to produce just one simple commodity, and they have to produce a lot of commodities to just live in general, that's going to spell deficit for their budget, and also eventually the death of the company. But what if the scenario was inversed or reversed? In that case, that implicates super profits. I'm going to talk about that later. The expansion of the company, not only for that one factory, but seeing that same factory everywhere else around the continent that supports that general market in general. Jesus Christ. But also the ability to see another day. And to go upon that topic of living to see another day, that's also found within, the scenario of the individual being equal to the market in terms of socially necessary labor time. But what I'm talking about in the scenario where the individual is lower than the market, there's an added contingency to that. That contingency is being able to see your own rise, essentially, to see that your company will not be like the others, that you can see the others fall while you rise. This is very important when we're talking about the accumulation of capital, or the centralization of capital, or monopolies. The plain and dirty word. But more upon that later. Now, surplus value, which I really denote it as little s, and you're going to find in a lot of Marxist equations that it's usually denoted by little s, is the excess of value produced by the labor power of a proletariat over the amount of wages that they are paid in a given day. That is to say, that the costs of production does not cover the entire input of labor that the laborer just inputted for the entire day. Most of that value is going back to the capitalist, which that is the actual profit that the capitalists make. They do not make it in the marketplace, which is different from super profits in general, but also is generated to buy more resources and to expand operation. In est, increasing constant capital in order to make more commodities. But just because you're buying more machines doesn't necessarily mean you're going to live on for a good amount of time. I'm just going to name call it right now, and it's going to pay me for me to not describe it in full length, but once constant capital rises and the variable capital lowers, so does surplus value lower. Why? Well, you're not paying as much to, give to the worker for them to live for another day, but also you're cutting into, your surplus value, the real profit that you make through this entire MCM circuit as a capitalist. The falling rate of profit really describes this entire concept real well. Again, it pains me to not talk about it, but let's move on, I suppose. Now let's get on to super profits that I mentioned early on. Super profits is essentially when you're selling at market rate, yet you're producing more than competition thanks to the fact that your business's socially necessary labor time is lower than the market average. Just let that pause. Let's just pause for a second. That's really a genius way to describe how the hell some capitalists just randomly just blow up, and then how that same capitalist will fall down rather immediately as well. Of course, again, Hegel's immediacy. They don't literally, and they don't do it at the same moment that they rise, but rather upon the fact that their lives, blooming up and not securing their artificial mountain of success collapses rather fairly quickly. But this super profits that the capitalist actually gets is also the same thing that they desire. They're never really going to get it because it's going to be deprecated over time, as every other business is literally going to fight to the death. Okay, maybe not the death, but probably going to industrially commit some industrial espionage to steal the tech in order to use it in their own factories so that they can be producing at the same socially necessary labor time but still sell at market rate the price of a commodity at any given time for a market that's based upon the old socially necessary labor time or the average socially necessary labor time that was given at the moment when everybody's socially necessary labor time was equal to each other, but also the fact that that dream is short-lived, even though they're still going to fight for it, even when that dream is by and large gone. But that's enough rambling about super profits. What is now essentially its opposite, the equalization of profits? The equalization of profits implicates when the profits, in this particular sense, equalize at the event of the original super profits, or the many multitude of events of super profits in any given industry, of course. Now, of course, the equalization of profits have many other particulars, which necessarily isn't this, but one of the many main particulars is describing how super profits generally decay over time, which also feeds into the falling rate of profit. Equalization of profits in another particular also describes when two industries' profits somehow, well, not somehow, but eventually equalizes as one industry is investing heavily into another industry to the point where eventually their profits are going to equalize with each other. Another particular of the equalization of profits is when businesses of the same industry have their profits eventually equalize to each other, when one business is finally going to catch up to the other business, but the other business is being cut off by this other business. This is essentially competition in general. This is where the one part of competition that is taught in bourgeois schools is technically correct, that there is competition, the competition to be profitable and to not die. What they don't go to discuss about is how it affects profits and how eventually profits are going to equalize with each other. But that's getting upon the subject of the falling rate of profit as well, which I made a commitment to not talk about in this video. So let's go on with the other subjects, so that they get their fair time of explaining. To just reiterate a point, the exchange value does not equate to a price. They could determine each other, but never equal each other. But that's just me reiterating a point. Let's get on to use value. Use value also doesn't equal price. This is actually an error of STV, or the subjective theory of value. Let's harp on this point of the subjective theory of value. One of the main criticisms that Marxists can generally use is the subject view of price. That being that I can say that my view of a pencil is astronomically high up on my list, but maybe for you, it could be really low on the list. Now, are either of us correct? Is there a militarian way of viewing this? Are either of us dead wrong, in fact? The answer for all three is no. That's because prices aren't entirely determined by use values, and again, that's an error on the subjective theory of value. To, again, not give a superficial but not complex way of understanding use value, I'm just going to state it outright. Use value is useful for supply and demand of a product. I don't know if I've already discussed this due to the fact of the sporadic nature of recording right now, but I'm just going to reiterate points if I already discussed it in life. Because of the fact that use value is useful for supply and demand, it helps determine these following quantities. It helps allocate labor, that being labor power, in an industry of some kind, It tells the bourgeoisie if a commodity needs to have production increased or decreased, and tells the bourgeoisie if ventures are worth investing into. Literally, the entire discussion of use value can easily debunk the entire mud pie argument, just in the outright sense. If it weren't for the fact that Marx discusses the mud pie argument literally 5 sections in, or maybe actually 10 sections in, nevertheless, because we already said that use value does not equal price, and the fact that use value is helpful for supply and demand, and helpful to guide them in order for them to actually determine what needs to be done in order to get more done or less done, really tells a lot when we're discussing Marxist economics in general, and the entirety of economics, for that matter. Now, to finish off on the MCM circuit, before I go ahead and describe about just one particular issue upon, the universal and particular talk, is going back to socially necessary labor. The one that I'm going to mention right now is that socially necessary labor implicates and determines intrinsic value of a commodity, not scarcity or utility themselves. Scarcity in the Marxist economic particular sense means the lack of commodities that are produced due to the fact that there isn't enough labor power being put into this industry, or, and this could be inclusive of just the generalization of just not enough labor power, but also the fact that it can easily be artificially hoarded from the marketplace, of course. Exempli grantia, diamonds have a minuscule socially necessary labor time to produce, and that's telling a lot. However, rarely do we see them in our diamond/jewelry stores, thus it gets a high price, but the intrinsic value doesn't really change. No really change if we just pumped all the diamonds into the marketplace. The intrinsic value of the diamond stays as is. You can throw it to the wall when there's not enough diamonds in the marketplace, and you can throw that same diamond to the wall when there's an unfathomable amount of diamonds in the marketplace. Thus, the point of scarcity implicating intrinsic value of a commodity is moot. Really, it's just telling us how much supply there is in a marketplace. To touch upon the point of utility, it's much like the conflation of use value equaling prices, which is only brought up in subjective theory of value. This point rather fails to comprehend contradictory personal opinions of the public, uppercase P public, mind you, in the same area for that same marketplace, in fact, and the market prices reflecting not the will of the people. Because if everybody thought that pencils deserved to be dirt cheap or free, then really the prices would be zero. But if everybody thought that pencils were really useful, then the prices would be astronomically high, or as high as they deserve to be high enough. Utility is just a core component of use value, which, again, use value feeds in to, supply and demand, but more upon the demand part than supply. In this way, we can say that scarcity implicates the supply of a market, and utility implicates the demand of a market. But it's important to mind you that scarcity and utilities are two big signifiers that is part of a larger signifier, being part of their own respective Marxist terminology, of course. But let's get on to rather discuss a point that I brought up earlier. In fact, the use value section, in fact. As of recording this and catching myself, I already discussed about universals and particulars, but let me bring it to a level of abstraction. No, not actually a level of abstraction, but let me universalize your look at particulars and universals as they relate to each other in a chain of particulars and universals, or shades of particulars to universals, or maybe steps from particulars to a universal, and how they can be symbolized as such. On one extreme of this chain, this shade, this step, the steps, is uppercase U universal, which have signifiers like uppercase G God, uppercase A absolute, uppercase R reason, uppercase O other, sometimes just called the big other by Lacan and Zizek, and so on and so on. The first step, the first chain, or the first shade right after the uppercase U universal that's heading to the direction of what I'm just going to discuss later is the first particular. It's a universal to second particulars, but a particular to the absolute, and particular to the other first particulars. In this sense, you could say that obviously a particular is subordinate to its universal, and but the universal relies on these particulars to make it up. After all, a universal is what it is and what it is not. And due to the fact that universals contain particulars, it's going to have particulars that don't necessarily equal to each other, because they're not necessarily equal to each other by being there and being differentiated with each other. Thus, they're only not equal by differentiation with each other, by the active opposition between each other, how they actively push each other off, which I described before, doesn't diminish their value as being particulars, but rather lights them up, like really makes them stand out from each other, but also reinforces the universal in general. And of course, we can go on with these chains until we get to the nth particular, the most individualized, the most atomized we can get of the individual universal and of particular to other nth particulars. This can be sometimes just called a universal particular, because this particular is shared across, first particulars, second particulars, and all the other nth particulars, and the only other particulars that isn't an nth particular itself. And why is it this way, that this nth particular is usually universal in itself, but maybe not for itself? It's due to the fact that there is no other particulars that preclude out of it, that come out of it.